Tonight we are in Deuteronomy chapter 11, and we're going to spend most of our time kind of in the center verses. And so if you are one who likes the titles, this one is called Rain from Heaven. Chapter 11, if you were reading through it, and we're not going to read the whole thing together tonight, but when you read through it, you kind of get the deja vu, right? I've heard this before. It's a lot of the same themes that we've heard before. Because chapter 11 is kind of a review of everything Moses has said thus far, especially in the second address thus far. If you remember, we talked about how most of Deuteronomy is comprised of 3 addresses, 3 sermons, so to speak, that Moses made. The first one was chapters 1 through 4. The second address is the longest, and it goes from chapter 5 all the way to the end of 26, I think. No, I'm not even thinking I didn't write it down. But so we're in the middle of this second address. And so he starts it with the Shema, this call to obedience, and what we're about to jump into is all the specifics, all the reasons that people don't really like Deuteronomy, like very specific stipulations, decrees, commands, things that seem very irrelevant at times, that get us bogged down or bored. So we're kind of going to change tempo, but what Moses is doing is kind of reminding them all once more, why do we obey? Why is this important? And he is reminding them that your obedience to God is founded in his salvation acts. And a lot of those themes he brings up again that we have seen throughout Deuteronomy, that in God's sovereignty, he has rescued them. In God's sovereignty, he took care of Pharaoh and the Egyptians. In his sovereignty, he will punish those who go against his decrees. And then that theme that we've seen since the very first night we got together of hearing, obeying, loving, and keeping the commandments. You keep them by doing, and then that is life. That you go from this here, you start with hearing, and it ends up with life. That this is the pattern they should follow. And that's what verse 1 even starts out with. Also the theme that Yahweh is the one who will dispossess the nations for them according to his promises. Not according to their righteousness, not because they deserved it, not because they're special, but because he loved them, he saved them, and he's fulfilling his promises. And so he is summarizing all of that, especially leaning really hard on the Shema. The language of that, you shall love the Lord your God, and love him alone. That Yahweh is God alone for the Israelites. That he's leaning hard in that, to love him because he alone is God. And he's setting them up again for what the specific Torah that's coming. All these really specific things, like now this is what you actually do. This is what it means to do them. And it's interesting because this is the same pattern that Moses used that happened back in Exodus 19. Exodus 19 is when the original covenant ceremony occurred. So they've been redeemed by Yahweh. They've been saved from the Egyptians. They're at the base of Mount Sinai. And then he says, God comes to them through Moses and says, you want to be my people? I'm offering this covenant to you. And then they agree. And then Moses goes and he receives the actual direct guidelines that are going to define this covenant relationship. So they've experienced his salvation. If you guys get anything, one of the key things to get out of studying Deuteronomy is that even in the Old Testament, salvation was never based on following the law because they didn't even get it until after they'd experienced his salvation and his redemption, and he had offered this to them to be his people, for him to be their God. Do you want to do this with me? And they said yes. And then that the Torah was a gift of grace, that it is not a hardship for them, that it was something they would have welcomed because it gave them clear expectations and guidelines for how do we maintain this relationship we've been offered, this great gift we've been given. How do we stay in it? Because we don't know the will of the gods, and God's like, not with me. You can know it. You will know it. That is a gift of grace. And so again, he's kind of repeating the covenant ceremony in a way with them. Remember what he did. He is Yahweh alone. And now we're going to get the specifics. Because we are covenant people, this is what our covenant behavior should look like. Because here's the thing, God's love is unconditional, and the covenant is eternal. It is not based on anything the Israelites do or don't do, except their possession of the land as a promise fulfilled is conditional. That depends, because it is a covenant benefit. The possession of the land is not their redemption. It is not their salvation. It is a covenant benefit. Being in the land is part and parcel of being covenant people. So you have to obey the covenant stipulations. Chief among them, Yahweh alone is God. And so in this chapter, Moses spends the center section really honing in on the land. He talks more about the land here than he will anywhere else in Deuteronomy. And it's not so much like what products are of the land. He focuses on one thing, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but he focuses on the aspect of water in the land. When we think about the land, I think sometimes we skip over it for a couple of reasons because A, it's not the covenant we're a part of, it's not the benefit, it's not the promise we're enjoying, and because we live in an age where our Christianity has taken this overly spiritualized sense. I don't know, like non-physical. Like we think of faith as like my personal faith, and I have this spiritual part of me because we've been influenced by, a Greek understanding of the body, where we've almost fallen into Gnosticism, which is a big fancy word for a heresy that said the body doesn't really matter, physicalness doesn't really matter. We preach that our hope is heaven, that we're going to go to heaven when we die, and I hate to tell it to you guys, and we can have this conversation later. Our hope is not in heaven. Our hope is, let me rephrase that. Our ultimate hope as Christians is not that we go to heaven when we die. It's an in-between period, guys. Because from chapter 1 of Genesis to Revelation 21, we are Adam. We are people made from earth, and there's a new earth coming. Like, we are creatures who are made with bodies that were declared good. And we've kind of divorced that. So when we think about land, we're like, well, that's just a temporal thing. That's all going away. Guess what? Land is not going away. Dirt is not going away, because once dirt goes away, so do we. Because we are dirt beings. That is who we are, imbued with the breath of the divine. And so the land is critically important. And what we see in Deuteronomy and throughout much of the Old Testament is the land is, you can't divorce it from the covenant. You have Yahweh, it's like an acute triangle, right? There's Yahweh here and Israel and the land. They're all interconnected because the land is such a crucial part of the promise. And God loves the land. Verse 12 today says, it is a land Yahweh your God cares for. The eyes of Yahweh your God are continually on it from the beginning of the year to its end. God loves the land of Israel. And if we had time, we would expand this out to talk about how God loves the earth. He declared it good. He loves his creation. He delights in what he has created. And we sometimes just take all of that temporal, we think it's temporal, we think it's physical, and it doesn't matter. And it matters. And it matters to God. And it's really crucially important here in Deuteronomy to the covenant. So we have this triangle where when the relationship between Yahweh and his people are good, then the relationship between Yahweh and the land will continue, and then the people will benefit from the land. And God takes delight in the land, that it produces and does what it should, that it produces the fruit that he created it to. In this chapter, though, the emphasis on the land isn't so much the products it makes, is the way that it makes them. And that is through water. And it is really hard just this week thinking about this and planning for it. It's like we have been in a washout. January and February in East Tennessee is quite possibly, I really despise the summer when it's like 90 degrees and never ending for months, but like this gray, and it's always misting or raining, and it's never freezing, so we never get snow. But it's like 30s, 40s, gray, rainy. And so it's hard for us to think about the fact that water is not always in great abundance in many parts of the world. And if you guys, I don't know, pay attention to kind of national news this week, which might have been hard, we are in a spot where we're inundated by water, but 7 western states, literally, they ran out of time on their second deadline given by the federal government because water is so crucial. The government came and said, you got to figure out, you 7 states who use water from the Colorado River, you have until the end of January. Figure out how to reduce your usage together, or we're going to tell you what you're going to do. 40%. They need to figure out how to reduce their usage by 40% because the Colorado River is running out of water. And when it reaches a certain level, it reaches Deadpool, which I thought was just the name of a horror movie or something. But that means there's not enough water to run over the dams. So not only do you run out of water for cities like LA and Phoenix, you have no power because the Hoover Dam is on the Colorado River. We're running out of power and we're running out of water. We have entire cities and suburbs and agricultural regions that depend on this, and they're all fighting about who's going to give up their water. Because California's like, I'm sorry, we have legal rights. They are the oldest. Everybody else has to run out of water before we get to give up ours. And Arizona's saying I'm sorry, we have native indigenous peoples, and the government said by treaty that they will give them water, and everyone upstream's like, we already did all we could, we're just upstream, what do you expect us to do? And there's also like a drought on top of that. But we can't even imagine like your city literally coming to you and saying like, I'm sorry, you don't have water. You may not know my day job is actually helping manage a ranch in Colorado and New Mexico. And this past summer in New Mexico, we actually got letters that said like, if you go over this usage, you will be fined hundreds of dollars. And there were letters that said, we don't know, but we may have to shut it down even more. We get irrigation water, and we didn't get irrigation water this year. It was, sorry, no irrigation water. You cannot water your crops this year. Water is essential for life. And in our security of our modern world, I think sometimes we forget that, and especially living in like a rainforest. So imagine, I mean, we have this hubris of like, we never thought the Colorado River was going to run out of water. When they were building the Phoenix suburbs in the, Southern California, no one ever anticipated, like, they set this contract up 100 years ago. No one anticipated water wouldn't run out. We can figure it out. We're the Enlightenment. We live in the scientific age. How do we run out of water? So imagine, go back thousands and thousands of years to an arid climate. Water is essential. And so here's what he says. I'm going to read 10 through 17 and then we'll work through it. He says, the land you are entering to take over is not like the land of Egypt, from which you have come, where you planted your seed and irrigated it by the foot as in a vegetable garden. But the land you are crossing the Jordan to take possession of is a land of mountains and valleys that drinks rain from heaven. It is a land the Lord your God cares for. The eyes of the Lord your God are continually on it from the beginning of the year to its end. So if you faithfully obey the commands I am giving you today, to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, then I will send rain on your land in its season, both autumn and spring rains, so that you may gather in your grain, new wine and olive oil. I will provide grass in the fields for your cattle, and you will eat and be satisfied. Be careful, or you will be enticed to turn away and worship other gods and bow down to them. Then the Lord's anger will burn against you, and he will shut up the heavens so that it will not rain, and the ground will yield no produce, and you will soon perish from the good land the Lord is giving you. In this section, he compares the land they're leaving, Egypt, and the land they're going to. And I think I'm hardwired to just assume everything about the promised land is the best. But like, I've never been to Israel. Like, that's one of my bucket list items. But like, I've seen enough pictures, like, you guys, it's not like the best agricultural area. It just isn't. And so rabbis have actually debated whether verse 10 and 11 is a positive, like praising the promised land, or a negative view of it. Because the Egyptians would never have wanted to go to Israel because they had the Nile. And when the Nile flooded, it would bring water to the fields, and then they would build canals and reservoirs to keep that water when the river went down, and they would grow their crops in that flat delta basin. And then one possibility for it means that they will irrigate it by foot is, and we still irrigate this way in places out west. Like, you have these canals with water, and here's your field, and you kind of build up a little mound, and then you literally go out and you like kick it down or shovel it down a hole, let the water run out, and you flood irrigate. So not like those perfect green circles you see from the sky, but flood irrigation. Just let it run in, runs all over the field, and you get moisture. When it's enough water, you build the little dam back up, and you wait till you have to do it again. But the water's there. Like, when you need it, there's water there. Contrasted with Israel, which drinks rain from heaven, which just sounds beautiful, right? But here's the thing. The rain has to come from heaven. Like, it has to come down. And the mention that it's a land of hills and valleys means it's not flat. So even if you collect the water, you can't get the water to the crops. Like, it's hillsides. You can't, unless you put it on top of the mountain, which isn't where the streams are deepest, like, you're not going to be able to irrigate it, is the point. Like, you can't hold on to the water and somehow get it there. You have to depend on God to bring the rain. And so it's this beautiful picture that it will rain if they are obedient to God. And if they don't, it ain't going to rain. It is the sign of ultimate trust. And God's saying, it's there, but you better believe in me. You better believe that I am the one who will bring the rain from heaven. And then not only that, he's like so specific about the autumn and the spring rains. And this is fascinating, and I'm going to run through it really quickly. But because rain, it's not just the amount you get, right? Like, it's when you get rain and how much you get. I was reading one commentary, and they were talking about how Israel actually, and I don't know if it's now or back then, but their annual rainfall, so like the amount of inches that they get in a year, is actually equal to a lot of temperate agricultural zones, like what we would consider more ideal agricultural areas. The difference is that in temperate agricultural areas, we get our rainfall over 12 months in about 180 days. So I know it feels like every day is raining, but it's only half of them, so good news. Israel, on the other hand, is going to get their rain in 40 to 60 days in a period of 7 to 8 months. So like there's months where there's going to be no rain whatsoever, and most of the rain is going to come at very specific times. And they have words for them. It's so predictable. Yorah is the word for first showers. So those start in fall, in October or November. And those rains are important because they soften the soil after the hard dryness of summer. When the ground is cracked, it softens it so they can plow it up, so they can get the seeds, so those seeds don't break their little necks trying to work their way out of it. And then 70% of the rain falls from December to February in that period of growth. And then there's going to be a slight dry period, and then they have the late rain, the spring rain, as it's called here, which is called the Malkash. Again, they have names for it. That's how important that their autumn and their spring rains are. They have specific names for them. And this burst of moisture occurs right as the final burst of growth is happening. So right as, your olives are filling out, as everything is getting to its peak of perfection, there's a final burst of rain, and then the harvest starts. And if rains come too early or too late, if the autumn rains were to come too late, they would need to have the crops in, and then they're not going to have the ground prepared, and the seed isn't going to take off. If they come too late in the spring, the plants have already reached their full maturation, so they're already going to be pretty sad, and then they're not going to be able to harvest it. And if you can't harvest whatever agricultural product is, there's a strong chance it can rot in the field. So you might be looking at a harvest that you can't get out. And once again, you guys, I relate to this. Our first year when my husband and I were we're doing the farming, and we do this crazy thing where we farm in Illinois. So every fall we decide to pack up the family and we drive to Illinois for 2 weeks and see if we can get 800 acres worth of grain out in 2 weeks. And we haven't accomplished it yet. And the first year we tried it, it decided to rain all of October. We sat up there for a week and a half, and I had to get the kids back to school, and we didn't turn a wheel. And I was like, okay, well, figure it out. And so my husband would go back, and we finished up before December, but you got to get it out, because soybeans, they get tough and they will go bad, and corn will fall down. Corn's tall, when it gets dry, it gets brittle, it falls down, then you can't get out either. And to think of okay, that's our income, but can you imagine if that's all of your food? That is what you are going to eat for the next year. So if those rains don't come right on time, it is terrifying, you guys. It is absolutely terrifying, because we don't know what food insecurity is. We have no clue what food insecurity is. But those rains are life itself. And so when God says, if you keep my commands, hear my word, love me, obey, and it's life. And life equals rain. Because if they obey, he's also going to send the rain. So the rain depends on obedience. I also just want to add a caveat here. I think I say this every time, but as I'm making correlations hey, do you know there's a drought in the western states? America's not ancient Israel. So I'm not in any way suggesting that our current predicament in the western states is because we just need to pray harder and then God's going to turn the tap back on. So I just want to make sure that we are on the same page on that aspect. Not that God won't send rain, but we are not ancient Israel. This is not us. In verse 17, though, what God says is that when the rain stops, they will perish soon from the land the Lord is giving them. He doesn't even have to kick them out. If they're disobedient, they won't lose the land. He doesn't even have to send invaders. They literally can't stay there. An often overlooked part of the book of Ruth, when it opens, is that the reason they move is because there's a famine. It's the period of Judges. It's before King David. But what every first year Hebrew student loves, because they like finding those ooh, look, it's really cool in Hebrew. It says there was a famine in the land and they had to leave Bethlehem. Well, in Hebrew, Bethlehem means house of bread. There was no food in the house of bread. This is a spot that was supposed to be abundant, and there's not. And then I went back and I was trying to figure out, and one of the two sons' names, the two sons who die in Moab, I can't remember what the connection is, but one of their names is actually connected to Shemesh, the sun god. So there is this connection where it seems to be, Elimelech is the dad's name, which means my God is king. But then the sons' names have kind of this allusion to possibly worship of other gods. And all of a sudden, there's no bread in Bethlehem. There's a famine in the land, because that's what happens when idolatry sets in. I also compare that then to when they move back, that the faithful covenant observer Boaz has abundant fields with abundant produce. Because here's the thing, other gods are the threats, and especially in Canaan, and especially when it comes to rain, because the main god of the Canaanites, all right, back up, sorry. Here's the thing, if you're an Israelite though, you're like, okay, obedience equals rain. But the Canaanites have been farming in the land of Israel for hundreds of years prior to this point. Like, they're not Yahweh worshipers and it's still raining. So like, there might be part of the Israelites who'd be like, well, it'll rain because it always has. Like, they grow crops, so we can grow crops. And there's going to be the temptation to pick up the habits of the Canaanites, because the chief god of the Canaanites is named Hadad. But you will probably know him better by his title. Much like Yahweh is called the Lord, Hadad is known regionally and locally by Baal, meaning Lord or Master. And he is the storm god. He is the god of rainfall. So the god the Canaanites always worship above all other ones is the god who makes sure that it rains. Because what's more important than anything in that area? That it rains. And so the temptation is always going to be just to hedge their bets just a little bit by worshiping the Baals on the side, because, he is the storm god and it worked for the Canaanites all those years. And then he has a consort, a female companion who is Asherah, and she's the goddess of fertility. So those two go hand in hand. And sometimes they'll be like, okay, we won't worship the Baals, but maybe we'll just keep the Asherahs, because we got Yahweh, our male god, and we got Asherah. Like, they're always trying to hedge their bets. And it goes terribly. And one of the best just dramatic stories of the Old Testament, I think, it comes into clear view, and it's 1 Kings 17 through 18, and we don't have time to read it, but it is the story of Elijah's showdown with Ahab during the drought. So in 1 Kings 17, it starts with Elijah showing up and saying, all right, you don't worship Yahweh, it's not going to rain. In fact, this is what he says. This is what Elijah says. As Yahweh, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word. And so it doesn't rain for 3 years. Like, it doesn't rain. Creeks dry up. People are starving. And God says, all right, it's time to have this showdown. And he shows up, and Ahab, after 3 years of worshiping Baal, they have hundreds of Baal prophets and priests. And he calls Elijah the troubler of Israel. And Elijah's response is, I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have, because you have abandoned Yahweh's commands, sounds familiar here, and have followed the Baals. You followed what you think is going to make it rain, and you won't give it up. Like, I'm trying to show you I'm the one who brings the rain. And so then, as the story goes, there's this call for the decision between Yahweh and Baal, which should have been easy at this point. Like, if your God works, it would be raining. And then he further proves that it doesn't work, which is one of the best stories, as they try and make their sacrifice light on fire, and they're cutting themselves and in frenzied dancing, and Elijah's yelling like, third grader insults at him, like, maybe he's in the bathroom, maybe you should cry harder. And then Elijah douses his with water and it lights on fire. And we usually end the story there, but that's not how the story ends. The story ends when Elijah gets on his knees and he prays. And now the Asherah and the Baals have been decimated. It rains. Because when the people disobey, they suffer the acts of the result of their disobedience, and the land suffers as well. And part of the exile, when the prophets declare that they're going to leave, is that the land will heal. Because their sin not only hurt them and their community, it hurt the land as well, because they're all interconnected. And this is the point that Moses is trying to get across to the people here. Like, you're going to go in, and it can be so good, but that you need that rain. And you don't need a god of rain. You don't need a goddess of fertility. All you need is Yahweh, and he will make it rain. And they're just not going to get it. They're going to keep going back to the ways the people around them have always done it and seem to have worked. And they're going to try it, and they're going to try it, and it's not going to be successful. And I know I'm running late on time, but one of the most beautiful kind of poetic descriptions of that comes from Hosea, of their continual, we're going to go after the Baals. Because it just seems like it should work. I can do it, and everyone's done it. And in Hosea chapter 2, verses 8 through 23, God again just points out to them, like, it never works, and it's never going to work. And he says it this way, and it lines up with everything Moses is saying. Like, it was there, Moses said it, and it's going to last all through their history. He says it this way, Hosea does. She has not acknowledged, she being Israel, that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine, and oil. Those three things sound familiar from this week's, directly out of Deuteronomy 11. I was the one who lavished on her the silver and gold, which they used for Baal. Therefore I will take away my grain when it ripens, and my new wine when it is ready. I will take back my wool and my linen intended to cover her naked body. So now I will expose her lewdness before the eyes of her lovers. But no one will take her out of my hands. I will stop all her celebrations, her yearly festivals, her new moons, her Sabbath days, all her appointed festivals. I will ruin her vines and her fig trees, which she said were pay from her lovers. I will make them a thicket, and wild animals will devour them. I will punish her for the day she burned incense to the Baals. She decked herself with rings and jewelry and went after her lovers, but me she forgot, declares the Lord. Therefore, I am now going to allure her. I will lead her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. There I will give her back her vineyards, and I will make the valley of trouble a door of hope. There she will respond to me as in the days of her youth, as in the days she came up out of Egypt, as in the days we're in right now in Deuteronomy. In that day, declares Yahweh, you will call me my husband, and you will no longer call me my master. My master, that word is Baal. So God is saying, I'm your husband who loves you. I'm not your Lord. I'm not your master. I don't want to rule over you harshly. I want to be your husband. I will remove the names of the Baals from her lips. No longer will their names be invoked. In that day I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field and the birds in the sky and the creatures that move along the ground, with all of the land, with all of creation. Bow and sword and battle I will abolish from the land so that they may lie down in safety. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge Yahweh. In that day I will respond, declares Yahweh. I will respond to the skies, and they will respond to the earth. And the earth will respond to the grain, the new wine, and the olive oil, and they will respond to Jezreel. I will plant her for myself in the land. I will show my love to the one I called not my loved one. I will say to those called not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God. We have this beautiful picture of God's redemption, and we see very clearly that obedience brings the rain. But there might be a part of you that's like, gosh, that's still seems a little harsh. Like, we're just going to shut up the skies. I mean, other ways in the prophets, they call it like that the ground will be like iron, that the sky will be like iron, hard, impenetrable, unyielding. And then you also get to Jesus, who says this thing in the Sermon on the Mount that God makes the rain fall on the righteous and the unrighteous. And so it seems to be like, well, what is it? Is we disobey and we don't get any rain, or does God send rain on the righteous and the unrighteous? Why such a harsh response? Because here's the thing, famine is nothing to mess around with. Like, famine kills. And it's a really bad way to go. And it's a harsh way to go. And then later in this chapter, he talks about, in chapter 11, he mentions the blessings and the curses. I put before you today blessings, the rain, and curses, no rain. And we will talk about those a little bit later because we get a whole chapter on blessings and curses at the end of Deuteronomy. So there is that part of, and maybe you're just like, no, it's fine. But like, there's that part of me that's like, man, like that's intense. It's intense. But here's the thing. They are God's covenant people. They have agreed to the stipulations. And here's the thing. Covenant people have covenant expectations that God does not have for non-covenant people. They had experienced his salvation, and he'd given them the offer. He'd given them the choice to make. You can be my people. Here's everything I'll offer to you. You need to, if you want to go in the land. And they said, yeah, we'll go. We'll take it. We want you. Of all the gods, we choose you because you proved yourself. And then he said, okay, great. And here's how you will act. And so he gave them a very clear guideline. And they had signed up for this. And the other thing is they signed up, besides agreeing to sole allegiance devotion, that being their choice, they signed up to be witnesses to the nations. They signed up to be his representation. We will be Yahweh's people. And he can't send rain on a land where people are praying for rain to the Baals. Because that's not a witness of Yahweh's power and sovereignty. That's just still more mass confusion. Like there's a couple gods, you just got to hedge your bets. But when you're getting the benefits of covenant relationship, you don't get to play both sides. You don't get to hedge your bets. You don't get to claim the promises without the requirements. The giving and withholding of rain is clearly laid out. And it was an immediate, wake-up call. Like, hey, it's not raining. We can go to the Baals, or we can go to Yahweh. Just like in Elijah's day. Like, all right, the sky has sealed shut. What do we do about it? Immediately, they knew we have strayed. What are we going to do about it? How do we get back on track? How do we heal this land? And the answers are right there. It's very clear. You go back to Yahweh. You cut down the Asherah poles. You break the Baal places of worship, and you go back to Yahweh. These days, the giving and withholding of rain is still under God's control, but I tend to think he lets the meteorological systems that he has created to do their own thing most of the time. It's not what he uses as a blessing and a curse upon, rain is a blessing, sometimes, not always. Again, rain could sometimes be a curse at the wrong time or too much of it. But he never sends this sort of, no, the skies are sealed up because you didn't do what I asked you to do. And that's where the drought is almost an act of grace. It's immediate. It calls you back. It lets you know that as the covenant people, you are not acting like covenant people. We are a people now who have the Holy Spirit to let us know when we have erred. But the bad news about the Holy Spirit is we can quench it, we can ignore it, we can redefine it according to how we want to. We don't have the physical, very concrete sign of we're in a famine, we're in trouble. We don't have a nation state anymore. It's the church. So we can't assume that what God is doing for an entire country is how he's guiding us. And so we have to be very careful as God's covenant people to make sure that we are living the way he expects, the way he has called us to. We are very intent in the church these days, it seems, to fight culture wars, to go out and make sure everybody else is living the righteous life God expects. But you guys, God's expectations are not for them. God's expectations are for us. He let the rain come and go on the Canaanites. It's when the Israelites moved in, he said, you want the rain? You're going to worship me. Before we start demanding that other people live according to covenant stipulations, we sure shootin' better make sure that we are living according to covenant expectations. We have the Spirit's help. It's not an impossible, we need the Spirit's help. We have the Spirit's help, but we cannot dull the Spirit. We have to start throwing our heads back and howling about the immorality, the sexual immorality in the culture around us, and then turning a blind eye to the rampant sexual abuse that happens in every single denomination right now. Because here's what I know, we don't have famine to show it to us, but we have the Spirit that's pointed out, and I do not want to be one of those people who has to wait till Jesus' return to find out what he's going to say about that. Because you guys, he's going to have something to say about that. The Israelites got the very immediate response of a drought and the scary reality of a hungry belly. He's given us grace right now in extending that. And he's given us grace in the Holy Spirit. But we have to remember that we still claim to be his covenant people. And if we want the covenant benefits, we have to live according to his expectations. He has graciously saved us. He has graciously given us his Spirit. But we have to make sure we don't temper that. We have to make sure that we are not worshiping the modern day Baals to get whatever it is we think we need, to keep our bellies full, or our places of power, or our security, or whatever it is that we're seeking, using the ways of the culture around us and not the way that God says we do it. Because God's not going to care how morally righteous we made a country around us if we were rotten on the inside. It's not necessarily, it doesn't sound like a hopeful way to end this. But I also like to remind us of the passage from Hosea. He wants us to recognize the filth that we have gotten ourselves into, the false gods that we have followed, because he is just literally dying to bring us back to himself. That's all he wants. He wants to erase the names of our false gods from our lips. He wants to bless us. He wants to have a community that knows him and walks in relationship with him. And we have to figure out how to stay tender to the Holy Spirit so that the world around us will see that we are a people of Yahweh who represent his character faithfully.